Hello and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and today's guest is Gaj Trifkovic, who talks about prisoner exchange and warfare in Yugoslavia in World War II. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Gaj Trifkovic, author of Parlaying with the Devil, Prisoner Exchange in Yugoslavia, 1941 to 1945, to be published by the University Press of Kentucky, June 23rd, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing on this very specific subject?
Well, actually, I, like all historians, had a pop phase. I used to call it the pop phase. So I liked reading about Rommel, Africa Corps, big tank clashes, Eastern Front, whatever. But then by 2005, when I started studying history, I became interested in World War II in Yugoslavia. I guess you have to be like a bit mature to mature as a historian to tackle the topic of this complexity. Mm-hmm. And as I don't know if you know, but it's really a complex topic. Mm-hmm. With you had at least 12 factions, and there was all kinds of politics and internal, external, and everything. But the basic premise, which I learned in school, because I was born in 1981, so I remember the socialist times. And there was this thing about the history of World War II. The basic point is that the communists legitimized their rule through the World War II narrative, mm-hmm. a special World War II narrative, in which they were basically do or die, uncompromising fighters against the Axis and against fascism. Mm-hmm. And topics such as prisoner exchange and political talks were, I wouldn't say taboo, but they were discouraged. Because why? Because they were not beneficial for the communists, for this idealized image, how they presented themselves. Mm-hmm. So they were usually either passed over in silence or mentioned, but without going into details, because any comprehensive approach would lead to, let's call them unpleasant truths. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why the research was segmented. For instance, there was an article on prisoner exchange with Italians back in 1967. And then there was another article on prisoner exchange with the Germans in 1977. And there was this otherwise really great book about the so-called March negotiations from 1943, which was published only in 1985. So the research was really fragmented. And this caught my eye because, the standard narrative was that they were killing the Germans wherever they met them, and the Germans did the same to them, of course. Mm-hmm. But then you learned that they were actually capable of sitting down on a table and negotiating things that could be of mutual interest. Mm-hmm. And I guess that I was fascinated with the triumph of practicality over brutality.
Mm-hmm. So how do you...
Let's call it so.
Okay. So let's talk about the book itself. Do you break it down chronologically, or is it thematic? How do you approach the subject?
Well, I use both approaches. Like the book is divided in altogether 5 chapters. The first one deals with Serbia. Why with Serbia? Because here, as I would dare say, in all other things pertaining to this part of Europe, there's balkanization. Mm-hmm. That means that everything is heavily fragmentized with different sets of rules and everything applying to different parts. And Serbia was special in this respect because, unlike the remainder of the country, there were no prisoner exchanges past 1941. And why was that? It was because Germans were especially sensitive about Serbia. They considered it a hotbed of insurgency and would really consider that anything but brute force would be considered as an act of weakness. So they didn't even bother offering prisoner exchanges or talking with the partisans or whatever. And that would last until the end of the war. Like there were no contacts there. Mm-hmm. In contrast, across the border in what was then the puppet state of Croatia, it was totally different. The Germans were weak. They had a weak contingent because this was supposed to be a friendly country, and they were, in fact, they were forced to negotiate through this weakness, and this is what led to the political contacts between the partisan supreme headquarters and the German commanders and ambassador in Zagreb, in what was capital of puppet state of Croatia. And that's the first round of these contacts, which took place in 1942, is the subject of the second chapter.
Let me interrupt you for one moment, just to give the listener some fundamental knowledge. Can you talk about, in Yugoslavia through this period, how much major fighting occurred and how much was simply German occupation, like police activity, that sort of thing?
Okay. There's one German document, I believe that's August 41, in which the Wehrmacht commander in the Balkans, I'm not sure if he's for the whole of the Balkans or just Serbia, in which he states, there is communist insurgency, but we don't need army reinforcements, because if the army takes the field and if it takes casualties, that's going to be a major propaganda coup for the insurgents. So we'll just use what police and collaborationist forces we have. Like a month later, they're already pleading for reinforcements from Greece, from France, from even from the USSR. So it escalated rather quickly into a major. When I say major, I don't wish to compare it, of course, with the Eastern Front or whatever, but it was highly unpleasant for the Germans. And by, let's say, mid-November, in addition to 3 divisions they already had in Serbia, which were rather weak, they received another one from Ukraine and one more from France. So it was, those were major operations going. There were major operations going on at the time. So it was, and I'm talking just about Serbia. The situation in Croatia and in Bosnia was and in Slovenia was very similar. In Montenegro, for instance, you had 4,000 Italians captured by the end of July by the insurgents. So it was really in flames.
Okay. All right. So let's step back then to what you were discussing, area by area.
I came to the third chapter, which deals with what was probably the most controversial episode of the war, and these were the March negotiations, so-called, of March 1943. And what's so controversial about them? Several issues. In very broad strokes, Tito and the bulk of his army were surrounded in a very small patch of land south of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they were practically facing destruction because they were surrounded on all sides. And out of desperation, Tito decided to build on the first round of negotiations, which happened in 1942, and offer Germans a truce, an exchange of prisoners. In exchange, he offered to withdraw to a neutral territory somewhere in the east, so outside of the German zone of occupation, not to attack the Germans. And was stated that they would oppose the British landing if it happened. And now for the past, what is it? It's still very controversial. For the past 70 years, the people are still debating whether these statements and offers were they real. Would they really have fought the British? Were these negotiations an act of collaboration, similar to agreements the Serbian royalists had with the Germans, because partisans accused them of collaborating with the Germans. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden it appears that the partisans are doing the same thing. So it's a very controversial topic and very complex one. And I felt it needed a chapter of its own, although it covers only the time frame between January and April 1943.
I'm speaking with Gaj Trifkovic, author of Parlaying with the Devil. You can find more information on his work at ResearchGate and academia.edu by searching for his name. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at WarScholar or on YouTube at WarScholar 1945. You can contact me directly on Twitter at WarScholar or on Instagram at Chris Alvarez WarScholar. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. And the other two chapters?
Yeah, the other two chapters. So there's the fourth chapter, actually, which is the centerpiece of the whole book, and it's about what was called the neutral zone at Pisarovina. Pisarovina is the name of a small village south of Zagreb, and this village was agreed to by both Germans and the partisans to be a neutral zone whose sole purpose was to facilitate the exchange of prisoners. So it was probably the only such spot in Europe. They didn't sign this agreement, but they made it was a gentleman's agreement that it would be honored, and it was honored. So that's the craziest thing about it. Mm-hmm. And the prisoners continued to be exchanged there until late April 1945, until the very last weeks of the war.
Was the German command aware of this all the way to the top, all the way to Hitler, or was there any part of it, was it kept hidden from higher ups for whatever reason?
Well, some of it was hidden, like day-to-day business. I don't know if it was hidden or they just didn't consider it necessary to include it in daily reports. Mm-hmm. But major things like March negotiations, they went all up to Hitler. Mm-hmm. And he was famous. He was famous for cutting them short by saying that you don't negotiate with rebels, you just shoot them. Mm-hmm. And that was that encapsulates, this one sentence encapsulates the entire German foreign policy in Second World War. I believe that Professor Klaus Schmieder told that. Whenever there was a chance of achieving anything diplomatically, Hitler would cut it short.
Mm-hmm. Was there any, with the prisoner, on the Yugoslav side, was there any coordination between the factions as far as which prisoners were exchanged, or was each faction dealt with individually?
Well, if you when you refer to Yugoslav factions, I take it you refer to Chetniks and the partisans, so the two competing guerrilla movements. One was communist-led, the other was royalist, but they were at odds with each other. They were they were in war since November 1941 and fought each other. Some say more viciously than they did the Germans. That was in each case. So definitely true for the Chetniks. The partisans, actually, all the major questions about the prisoner exchange were decided on the top by partisan leader Tito and a small group of officers around him. But there were differences. There were regional differences in how the partisans in Slovenia, for instance, approached this problem compared to the partisans in Macedonia. But there was the guideline was that utilize prisoners if you can. Like, don't shoot them if you can get some of our guys for them. But how this was achieved and whether an exchange would be offered, here we again touch upon the Balkanization, because every commander practically had the last word in the exchange proceedings. Like, one brigade commander would be happy to go along with it. The guy who came behind him wouldn't. And it's really fragmented, and each case is a separate story, basically. Although there were, as I said, some guidelines which were basically obeyed by the partisans throughout the country from 1943 onwards, let's say.
Were the Germans only taking fighters as prisoners, or did they also take civilians as prisoners who they later exchanged?
Well, they were taking everyone who was suspicious of being a partisan supporter or an active partisan or an underground worker. And of course, the prisons and concentration camps were overflowing by these people. The problem was, at least for the partisans, that they had to choose from this small multitude, and they had to choose very carefully. They would, for instance, because the number of captured Germans was never as high as the number of people suspected of harboring partisan sympathies. So they had to choose very carefully, and they would, for the most part, choose like veteran fighters or party members. But there was, of course, this personal touch. Some high-ranking functionaries saved their relatives, and well, the same was true for the Germans. Of course, there were like interventions flowing in from all sides to the people who were responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the exchange cartel.
Were there any instances where one side gave the other a list of names, and maybe some of those names were shot or dealt with harshly because they knew that they were important to the other side?
Yes, that occurred rather often, but it was not usually done by the Germans, if we take the Axis side, but by their underlings, so the Croatian fascists. Like the moment because they were running the camps and in which these communist suspects were incarcerated by the police. And when the Germans would often come and say, okay, here we have a release form for these guys. And almost always the Ustaša, the Croatian fascists would say, oh, we don't know these guys. They're not in our hands. And in fact, they were, but they weren't ready to part with these captives so that the Germans could get their guys out. Ustaša wanted their guys out also, but there was a problem because there was this really, if I can call it, a blood feud between the Ustaša, i.e. Croatian fascists, and the partisans, who were like, there was really a war of extermination between the two. And it was very, very hard to find enough suitable prisoners in order to exchange them, in their case. So yes, they would often say the people who the Germans requested were not there, because if the partisans are requesting them, it means that they're important, and we ain't gonna give them.
What you mentioned? There's a fifth chapter also. Have you touched on that one as well?
No. So the fifth chapter is about these local affairs, which were negotiated between the forces in the field by the army units on both sides. But it's, of course, the frequency of these affairs was directly connected to the issue of the main negotiations which were led in Zagreb about this exchange cartel in Pisarovina. So you have a spike in local prisoner exchanges in 1944 and 1945. So as soon as this cartel was agreed upon, the word went out: save your prisoners, either exchange them yourselves or send them to us and we'll exchange them for you. And that's basically what the fifth chapter is about, and it covers the entire country. And there are some different episodes from from Slovenia, from Macedonia, Bosnia. Everything is covered there.
Mm-hmm. A question I had forgot to ask previously: were there any non-German fighters held by the partisans, and not Yugoslav fighters, but rather German allies, like Italians or anyone else from other countries that were held and were perhaps exchanged?
Yes, the exchange, the prisoner exchange that the partisans had with the Germans, they had a similar thing, although without the cartel and without the neutral zone. It wasn't that formalized. They had it with practically every opposing side in the country. So they were swapping prisoners with Italians already from 1941. And they were doing the same with the regular armed forces of the independent state of Croatia. Mm-hmm. And they were swapping prisoners with the Chetniks and basically with everyone, because that was the only way you could protect your people who fell into captivity. Mm-hmm. There was no other way. There was no international law. So this was the only way to save them, was to appeal to your enemy's self-interest.
So again, I think you kind of implied some of it already. I don't think you said directly, but why did this occur in this area of operations and not other parts of Europe?
It did occur in other parts of Europe because, as I said, that was the only way to protect your fighters if you are an irregular army. Mm-hmm. Maybe so it would be beneficial to give a few examples from American history. Mm-hmm. The same principle applied to the prisoner of war issue between the Continental Army and the British Army during the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. The British didn't recognize the Americans as lawful belligerents. They were rebels. Mm-hmm. And the Americans wanted to achieve this recognition through prisoner exchange. And the same thing happened during the Civil War, where the southern states and the Union, they exchanged prisoners right up until 1863, I believe, when the Union canceled the cartel. So basically, whenever there's a rebel, there is prisoner exchange. They were registered in Greece. They were registered in France. They were registered in Italy. Mm-hmm. But what made them so massive in Yugoslavia, I believe, is because the operations were so much more intensive there than in the other parts of occupied Europe. Mm-hmm. There are like lists with names of Germans who were gone missing, which are like I believe 700 names in one list or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that was like only one list from mid 1944, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it was really massive, and it was getting even more massive as the time progressed. As the partisans grew, as they got more guns, the operations grew bigger, and the number of prisoners grew with it.
Considering you said before that Hitler said all rebels should be shot. How do you know how he was convinced to go ahead with this exchange program?
I believe that he was convinced by the practical arguments. They told him, prisoner, we need these contacts with the bandits, as they call them, in order to gain intelligence, in order to find out more about their plans through these informal conversations, which were an integral part of the negotiations. And with the fact that the Germans were getting their men back in this way, because Balkans wasn't quite high on the priority list of the German High Command, and whatever they could save, well, better. It was better for the army in the Balkans there, because that would mean less men to ask Berlin for. So these were these practical considerations, and basically Hitler would grumble a bit, but would usually go with what the commander suggested.
So thinking about the people that Germany wanted in concentration camps, Jewish people, gypsies, other, quote, undesirables in their eyes. Were any of those people involved in any prisoner exchanges in Yugoslavia that you know of?
I can't remember any particular case. I don't remember seeing. No, I don't even think that was like thematized at all. Like they would be, for instance, the partisans would ask the people back based on their service record, on their rank. If any Jews were among them, I'm not sure. Maybe, but I don't quote me on that.
Okay. Were there any prisoners exchanged that you were pretty surprised that you saw were agreed to be exchanged and exchanged? That's
a good question. But basically, the rule was we can get anyone out, just name the right price, So there were like people like Ustasha policemen, like notorious policemen, who would probably be shot maybe days after capture. But who were released? But they were released in exchange for, let's say, 16 partisans or 17 or 20 partisans. So if you could, like one American officer described the partisans saying that Tito and the others are horse traders. So you just have to haggle, and basically you can agree anything. They were like born traders. So there were like chiefs of. There was actually one chief of Nazi security service in a regional center in Bosnia. He was exchanged, for instance, for, I don't know, I believe 20 or something people. But there were also people like who highly decorated officers, like Luftwaffe ace, who downed 188 Allied airplanes, who fell overhead, who was shot down over Herzegovina in December 1943, and who was just executed by the local partisans without waiting, without asking the higher-ups what they should do with this, because pilots were very valuable. They were known as very valuable hostages. The Germans would always ask for them first, but they simply shot them. And there were no rules. Basically, there were no surprises.
Right.
Either for high-ranking Nazi officials or veterans, anything could happen.
So near the end of the war, did you see the Germans trying to exchange much more quickly as they pulled out, or how did things change as the war was ending with this whole setup?
You're quite right. The prisoner exchanges in 1945 exchanged, I believe, more often than in the preceding years. I mean, per month. But the problem the problem was now, for instance, partisans by this time had large liberated territories, like half of the country stood permanently, so it was permanently theirs, and they had prisoner of war camps, and what's very important, they were negotiating from the position of strength. So, for instance, okay, prisoner exchange was still useful, but by now, for instance, they would sometimes be in habit of shooting the officers whom they captured, who could have been exchanged. Like you could get several ordinary fighters or underground workers for a single officer. But by the end of the war, they came to care less and less. And the Germans were, of course, they were eager to get as many of their people as they could. They even proposed to exchange like 2,000, I believe, soldiers of the former Yugoslav army, which went into captivity in April 1941, to exchange 2,000 of them for a similar number of their own soldiers whom they thought were wounded in partisan captivity. So they were, and that offer was made, I believe, in April 1945.
I'm speaking with Gaj Trifkovic, author of Parlaying with the Devil. You can find more information on his work at ResearchGate and academia.edu by searching for his name. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at WarScholar or on YouTube at WarScholar 1945. You can contact me directly on Twitter at WarScholar or on Instagram at Chris Alvarez WarScholar. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. So, two questions here. When the Germans finally left, was there any large-scale execution of prisoners? That's the first question I'll ask.
Well, that again depends on the time frame and on the location.
Okay.
In Serbia, as I mentioned, where no prisoners were exchanged and where the levels of violence remained high throughout the war, shootings in concentration camps where the captive members of the People's Liberation Movement were held, they continued until days before Belgrade was liberated, for instance. These concentration camps were located in Belgrade, and they were shooting prisoners like until the very end. There was this fairly large exchange in Skopje, the capital of Macedonia, northern Macedonia today, where Macedonian prisoners exchanged like hundreds of their people for 100 partisans on the outskirts of the city. Several days after that, the Germans withdrew from the city and executed the remaining captives. I don't think that they executed any captives when they were withdrawing from Zagreb in early May 1945, because they knew how the war would end, basically, or they were aware of the possibility that they might be taken captive by the Yugoslavs, and so they decided to spare Zagreb of demolitions. And I believe that they didn't touch what remaining prisoners they had in their hands.
And then the second part is at the end of the war, or let's say when it ended in Yugoslavia, when the Germans left, were there many German POWs or Axis POWs in Yugoslavia, and what ended up happening to them? Do you know?
Yeah. according to the official Yugoslav statistic, the Yugoslavs captured, and I'm not sure if that probably refers to the whole period from, let's say, 20th March to 15th of May, that they captured about 220 or 230,000 members of the German armed forces. Mm-hmm. Mind you, this number includes like 40,000 Italians who were attached to German formations in one capacity or the other, and it also includes a lot of people who were born in Romania or Hungary or Poland, whom the Nazis decided to make Germans when they ran out of manpower.
Okay.
And they were basically captured as German soldiers in German uniforms, but how Germans were they, that's debatable. Mm-hmm. In any case, there were at least, I believe, about 90,000 or 100,000 Germans and maybe 20, 30,000 Austrians captured in Yugoslavia in the closing days of the war. And that is basically an under-researched topic because no one in the former Yugoslavia actually has much interest in it. It doesn't. You can't use that in daily politics, and that's a defining factor, I'm afraid, in defining historical research. Mm-hmm. So no one cares about what happened to Germans. Basically, we have a German eyewitness accounts, which were full of dreadful stories, and certainly dreadful things did happen. But we have to, of course, remember that these statements were given during the Cold War and by the people who were pretty bitter about how the war ended. And there are very few Yugoslav documents which surfaced about what happened in the prisoner of war camps. I believe that the German Red Cross mentioned something about 85,000 repatriated, and I'm not sure which were repatriated until 1949, whereby I'm not sure that this number includes Austrians. So anyway, about 85,000 and whatever Austrians were repatriated to. There were some processes organized, but that was mostly so against officers, and there was a special prisoner of war camp for war criminals, where they were held until they could be tried. But it was a group of about, I believe, 1,000 or 1,500 men, and the last remaining were released, I believe, in 1952 already. Even like people who were sentenced to long prison sentences by the Yugoslavs, and the Yugoslav military tribunals, they were pretty harsh. But even them, like who were sentenced to 20, 30 years, they were released in 1952, and I believe that has to do with the isolated position of Yugoslavia back then. There was this split with Stalin, and Yugoslavia was like alone between East and West, and they were probably doing what they could to appease the West in some way, and that's by releasing these remaining prisoners.
That's actually the question I was going to ask, because I wondered if at that point Yugoslavia was under the influence of the communist bloc. And then do they release prisoners to East Germany or West Germany? There's that whole thing.
That's the point which I've forgotten a while ago. I mentioned the 85,000 Germans who were repatriated. I'm not sure if there was a number of those who were repatriated to West Germany or to East Germany as well. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about that. So the number could be higher.
But that's outside of the scope of your book, so... Yes.
But as you asked whether Yugoslavia was under communist influence, yes, but it was under the influence of the local communists, of the Yugoslav communists, who were at that time at loggerheads with the Soviets. There was like a semi-war situation on the borders because they split in 1948. So as I said, the release of German prisoners, it follows the European pattern. By beginning of 50s, no one cared basically what these guys did during the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just forgot.
And I find it fascinating that the Yugoslav communists thought as well, and that's because that's another example of their famous practicality when they would, disregard ideology for a moment if any immediate gain could be made.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn towards how you did your research. What sort of archives did you use? How did you get your information?
So I first went through, I believe, literally hundreds of books, like unit monographs, unit histories, memoir literature from all sides. So from Yugoslav and German alike. Of course, Yugoslav is more voluminous. Then I went through documents of all sides involved. In the partisan case, there's this very handy thing called collection of documents and data on the People's Liberation War of Yugoslavia. That was like additional documents similar to the official papers of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And from 1949 to 1989, there were 170 books published, I believe. And each of them on average is at least 600-700 pages of documents. So I went through those. That was handy because I did visit the main, I'll call it partisan archive in Belgrade. Mm-hmm. But this is very useful to have these books. Mm-hmm. And for the German documents, I went through the microfilmed, now they're digitized documents of German army units, which are stored at the U.S. National Archives. Mm. And there is an interesting thing about it, especially about the Germans, but to a fair extent also for the Yugoslavs, that there is a lot of self-censorship regarding these things. Like Germans would, for instance, when and if these diaries are available, because after mid-1944 we have only the highest level, like Army Group, and there the issues discussed there have little to do with the prisoner exchange. They have to do with strategy and operations and whatever. But on the lower levels, like regiments and battalions and divisions, you sometimes encounter a sentence like one soldier returned from bandit captivity. And then you take a Yugoslav book, like dealing with the same time frame and the same location, and you find that there was an exchange there. Maybe not the same date, usually not the same date, but you find a clue. Mm-hmm. And there's literally, I ran into several of such instances. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of tricky, but it's more fun. It's a challenge to reconstruct all these events and not having all the information you need, like stored in 5, 10, 12 folders. So you just go through them and pick whatever you need. Regarding the archives, there is one very interesting thing. The Croatian state archives have this collection of documents they inherited from the Yugoslav secret police. And luckily for me, there was a whole collection of documents, interrogations of German personnel who were at Zagreb at that time. And these are like old-fashioned, like an old-fashioned collage. You have a personal file on Tito, for instance, and in that file you have statements of like 20 people who had anything to do with Tito. And they're literally cut and pasted and glued together. And there was, in absence of official documents, because official documents from that time and from this special German commando for prisoner exchange did not survive. And in their absence, this was truly a treasure trove, because you find all sorts of informations they had on various people, and as I said, they're compiled usually from post-war interrogations of the Germans who were captured.
Okay.
So you have even personal information like who dabbled in black markets, who like sold from the partisans and then sold it in Zagreb and made money. Yeah. And there were of course such things happening too.
What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
Well, when you're into something, when you love the topic, everything is enjoyable. But I would especially mention this fourth chapter, the neutral zone at Pisarovina. That is, as I said, the centerpiece of the work, because it's really it didn't get much attention, not even in Yugoslavia, and you could really read very little about it, and of course then I was happy to find these documents in Zagreb, which allowed me to reconstruct it, I believe, satisfactorily. That was like great. I went all through the German documents from National Archives and Records Administration, everything, and there was always a sentence here, sentence there, and then I found this great collection and could use it, of course.
Were you able to visit the site or any sites associated with these exchanges?
To tell you the truth, I didn't even try. I didn't even try. I was mostly short on time, and I did send a letter to the municipal office in this village, inquiring about details, but never received an answer. So
okay.
But there are no monuments there. There are just patches of land where both sides would bring their captives and load it onto trucks and simply exchange them and then go about their business.
I'm just curious if now, it's a situation where now wherever it happened there's a supermarket there now or something, and people have no idea,
Well, that I don't know. Maybe you're right about this village as well. But as I said, I received no answer. So you're probably right. I would also guess that they never heard about these things happening in their backyard, so to say.
What did you find that was most surprising when you researched this book?
And what I found most surprising. Well, basically, I was surprised at the as I mentioned it already, about the triumph of practicality over brutality, like that these mortal foes, really mortal foes, who were slaughtering each other mercilessly in the field of battle, were actually able to restrain themselves and to do basically what was the right thing to do. Although, as I said earlier, that had a little to do with humanitarianism, but more without self-interest, or should we call it narcissist humanitarianism. They were concerned only for the well-being of their own people, of course, and not for the well-being of prisoners in general. And that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty surprised that this went on, especially in an area that was so involved so much brutality. But there it is.
Yeah, they were like, as I said, they had this neutral zone. They said like, okay, 5 kilometers from here, 5 kilometer radius from the center of the village, no one may maintain troops. No side may conduct movements. No attacks may be organized from there. And there were, of course, incidents happening. But basically, both sides were very scrupulous about it. And like, you have like legendary Yugoslav partisans, and then on the other side you had these brutal occupiers, these well, let's call them stereotypes. And then all of a sudden, they say, okay, we have a gentleman's agreement. They didn't sign anything. That's the big gap I couldn't fill. They were supposed to sign this agreement establishing this neutral zone. So it was supposed to be like really, really formal, but it was never signed, and I simply couldn't find out why. There were simply not enough documents available, and no one mentioned it. Both sides mention it like independent. You can find it in independent sources that it wasn't signed, so it probably wasn't. But why wasn't it signed? I don't know. That's like a gap, and I mentioned that also in the book. Basically saying I'm sorry.
Not to ask too light a question, but do you have any evidence that in this neutral area, maybe the two sides would get together and sit down and have beers and have cordial conversations, or was it just completely antagonistic when they got together?
There is that is another interesting aspect, or maybe the part of the aspect we mentioned earlier. This human aspect of things. They were the people who were doing the negotiations, because both sides had a fairly permanent representatives for prisoner exchange. So these people met, I don't know, maybe once, twice a month or something like that. And they began to behave as work colleagues, basically, like any other people who were there, maybe not doing the business, maybe that was not to their liking, maybe wasn't pleasant, but they had to do it. And with time and through these frequent contacts, they actually established, some of them even established what might be termed as friendly relations. Although they were, as I said, they were like mortal foes. And yes, they were like, for instance, there's one example which is very dear to me, when a chief partisan negotiator, this guy was a communist since early 20s, so he was like the hardcore, absolutely reliable member of the Communist Party. He invited his two German colleagues to his family apartment in Zagreb for a Christmas dinner in 1943. His mother and sister were still living in Zagreb, and he came just on 25th December. He came with these two guys and had a dinner, like a family dinner.
Oh wow!
And yeah, and what's even more fascinating, that the relatives of partisan envoys were usually not molested by the Germans, and not even by the Ustashe. That's very interesting. They probably, I believe that the German realized that these were like fanatics, and even if we like take his mother and family members hostage, that won't change anything. Like he won't betray his side or whatever. So there is several examples really where these family members lived in Zagreb, so at the heart of the occupied Croatia, throughout the war, without ever once being like molested or interrogated by the police or whatever. That was like there was like a mutual understanding that wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And some who were not sure about about having a mere gentleman's agreement would actually procure a letter of guarantee from the German general in Zagreb,
Mm-hmm.
which stated that these people stood under German protection and so on. But that was mostly done out of fear for the Ustaše, who often sabotaged these talks. Germans themselves, as Gilas, the famous dissident, said himself, they treated them very correctly while they were in Zagreb.
So apart from filling the historical record, what else do you hope the book will do for readers?
I hope that it will draw their attention to this largely forgotten theater of war, which was Yugoslavia from 1941 to 1945. One of the reasons I wrote it in English, I studied in Austria, so I could have done it in German. But I decided to do it in English because I felt that this gap about in knowledge about what happened during the war here is really big, and like I believe it's roughly treated, so to say. Although, as I said, it's so complex that it's also so incredibly interesting. This war, it was had so many levels, had so many issues at hand. The ideological war against Germany, British partisan relations. So everything was there, and apart from some aspects like the British-Chetnik relations or something like that, it's really didn't get the attention that it deserved. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's fun. It's also, like, as I said, as you probably can gather from the anecdotes I told you, it's really fun to read. I mean, I tried to make it that way by including as many anecdotes that I could, but I believe, as I said, that it's, although of course it's maybe me, I'm of course biased. But I think, really, I think that the average reader could find the whole topic interesting and fascinating, and things he could never imagine that had happened in the heart of occupied Europe. Well, yeah, they did. It's crazy, but it did.
It seems the book has, I assume it has a fair amount of human element to it. Like you say, these anecdotes about individual persons.
I tried to make it like that. I have to tell you, like, that when I was a kid, I obtained a copy of Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day, and I was fascinated by the way he recreated these events based on human stories, and I really tried to do a similar thing. So also in order to make it more readable, because if you only put in facts and figures and this exchange happened here, this exchange happened there, you can just compile a chronology and put it on internet and that's it. But you really, this human side needs to be told, and it needs to be told in English, I believe, because, as I said, you have a fair amount of books on political history of the war, on Chetnik British relations, partisan British relations, but these are all based, and as they should be, on official correspondence and on documents. And really, the human dimension of the war is somehow hidden. Okay. And I tried to at least set it straight. As far as I could, of course, and as far as it was relevant to the main topic. So yeah, I included every single story that I could, and there are quite some of these stories. If you mentioned the drink, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was actually an event. There was actually an exchange in which the envoys did precisely that. Although they didn't know each other, that was the first time they meet. They went into the tavern and had a glass of beer. And there was because they were most of the people on both sides were curious about the enemy. They weren't hostile for the most part. They were just curious to see what a real live enemy looked like.
Yeah.
How he thought, what was on his mind. And so they just sat in the tavern and had a glass of beer and had a conversation and then parted way.
Interesting. Yeah, that is.
Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, that's like August 1943. It's only several days ago. The partisans in that same area wiped out a company of soldiers, capturing 60 of them and killing 30.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and 2 or 3, or I don't know, maybe a week later, these guys are having beer.
Interesting. Yeah, those are interesting stories.
Yeah, that's it, and it's full of them.
So, did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
So I finished it without major problems, but the publishing was a tricky part, and you probably know it. Huh? You wouldn't ask that question if you didn't.
I always ask this actually.
No, I know. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm referring basically to this. I don't know. It's a perennial problem of all historians, at least in recent times. Everyone I talked to had these massive problems about book publishing, especially if it's Second World War. So I prepared the proposal, and I believe I contacted at least a dozen publishing houses. And most of them refused it on grounds that it didn't fit in their program. These were mostly university press houses, publishing houses. And then I had a conversation with Robert von Meyer, who's a editor-in-chief of Global War Studies, so peer-reviewed World War II journal, where I published 2 articles already. And then he expressed his intention and wish to see this book published. And then it took some time until he made an arrangement with the University Press of Kentucky. And then the only thing that remained was to go through the manuscript, I believe, 5 or 6 times. I don't know, with 3 pairs of eyes. There was Robert, there was his wife Sharon, and there was me. And we were on Skype day and night going through the manuscript. And if you look at it now, you'll probably find typos, and so it's like never-ending story.
But it got done.
Yeah, finally.
What's your current or future writing project?
I'm currently working on a single volume military history of the war. So of the Second World War in Yugoslavia, I mean.
Okay.
So just don't. I was referring to Second World War in general. So and that'll be basically the military history of the partisan movement.
Okay.
And I'm doing it also for the same reason I did this book, to plug this huge gap in English-speaking academic world or publishing world, where there's literally no similar title, I believe, in existence.
Okay.
I believe that Yugoslavs maybe translated their official history in the late 70s and published it in English. But that's, I believe, the only such book in existence. And of course, being written in mid-70s, it's of course written according to certain rules. And what I'm hoping to give to do here is to give a modern, unbiased view of the partisan movement and their military efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it will hopefully be out next year. So watch out.
Okay. All right. Good. So where can people find you on the web? Do you have a web page, social media, anything like that?
Yes, I have active profiles on researchgate.net and academia.edu.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to point out that the book contains only select bibliography.
Mm-hmm.
Because a full bibliography would have taken too many pages, so we decided on a selective bibliography. And I plan on uploading the full bibliography on my profiles on these two academic networks.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone is interested, that would be good to know.
Okay, and I'll spell your name for anyone who searches for you. It's first name Gaj and last name Trifkovic with the little mark on it.
Yes, that's right. That's perfect.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Oh, nothing except that I wish to thank you for having me. It was truly an honor, and it was really enjoyable for me.
Okay, good. Me too. I appreciate your time. Thanks. Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at WarScholar.org. On YouTube at WarScholar 1945, on Facebook at WarScholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez WarScholar, and on Twitter at WarScholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.